Some people are just destined for the trash heap of history, aren't they, Ms. Reed? Lacking the breeding, the intellectual horsepower, the simple social grace to contribute anything of value. The seminar room, filled with the sons and daughters of legacy and privilege, rippled with condescending snickers. The speaker, Professor Alastair Finch, a man whose tweed jacket and self-satisfied smirk were as much a part of the university's architecture as the ivy on the walls, leaned back in his chair, basking in the cheap validation of his students. He had made his point. Young Evelyn Reed, whose work-worn hands and scholarship-funded attendance marked her as an outsider, was, in his esteemed opinion, an intellectual weed in a garden of prize-winning roses. The crowd laughed. She did not. Her face remained a placid mask of neutrality. There was no flash of anger in her eyes, no tremble of the lip, no defensive retort. She simply met his gaze for a brief, unreadable moment, then calmly, methodically, began to pack her worn textbooks into a faded canvas bag. The deliberate slowness of her actions was its own form of defiance, a pocket of immense calm in a room crackling with casual cruelty. She zipped the bag, stood, and walked out of the room without a backward glance, the sound of Finch's continued pontificating fading behind her. Her silence was a question he was too arrogant to even notice, let alone answer. But 20 years later, when the rhythmic, concussive beat of Black Hawk helicopter rotors thundered against the stained-glass windows of that same hallowed university, the answer would arrive with the force of a hurricane. It would arrive in the form of a quiet woman in a crisp, unadorned uniform, a woman whose unassuming presence belied a history written in fire and shadow. If you believe that true legacy is not inherited but forged in the crucibles of adversity, type "forged" in the comments below. 20 years had done little to humble Dean Alastair Finch. The professorship had morphed into a deanship, the tweed jacket replaced by a tailored suit, but the core of the man, the unshakable belief in his own intellectual and social superiority, remained perfectly preserved. He now stood at the podium in Northwood University's newly minted Strategic Studies Center, a monument to his own ambition. Today was his magnum opus, the Northwood National Security Summit, a gathering of the nation's sharpest minds from academia, policy, and the military. Finch preened, his voice echoing with practiced authority as he welcomed the attendees. He spoke of theoretical frameworks, of geopolitical paradigms, of the grand chess match of global power. He was a master of words, a connoisseur of concepts. The arrival of the keynote security delegation from Naval Special Warfare Command was the capstone of his event. He expected a barrel-chested admiral, a man whose presence would fill the room, whose voice would carry the weight of command. Instead, a single officer entered first, flanked by two others. She was of average height, with a lean, wiry frame that was lost in the simple cut of her service uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, regulation bun, and her face was devoid of makeup, a canvas of disciplined neutrality. She moved with an unnerving economy of motion, her eyes sweeping the room not with curiosity, but with a calm, predatory assessment that went entirely unnoticed by the pompous dean. Finch's face fell into a mask of barely concealed disappointment. He strode over to the president of the university, General Wallace Thorne, a retired four-star who had seen more of the world's ugliness than Finch had read about in books. "General," Finch whispered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is this who they sent? A librarian? I was expecting a warrior, not a clerical assistant to manage our security." Thorne's eyes, however, were fixed on the woman. He saw something Finch could not. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible wear on the bezel of her dive watch, the perfect posture that spoke of a core forged from iron, and the profound, unnerving stillness in her eyes, the look of a person who had stared into the abyss and had not blinked. The summit proceeded as Finch had planned, a symphony of self-congratulation and intellectual posturing. Panels discussed asymmetric warfare, cyber threats, and fourth-generation conflict with the detached air of academics dissecting a butterfly. Dean Finch was in his element, moderating a discussion on crisis response. He spoke eloquently about command and control theory, about the OODA loop, about the psychological pressures on decision-makers. It was all clean, sterile, and utterly theoretical. Then, the world dissolved into chaos. A piercing alarm blared through the auditorium, followed by a synthesized voice, cold and robotic. Security alert. Facility lockdown initiated. This is a drill. Repeat, this is a drill. Despite the announcement, panic flared. Academics and policy wonks, people accustomed to controlling narratives, were suddenly powerless. They fumbled with their phones, looked around with wide, fearful eyes, and began to chatter nervously. Finch, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate his theoretical mastery, stepped forward. "Everyone, remain calm," he boomed, his voice a half-octave too high. "Follow standard evacuation protocols. Security, form a perimeter at the main entrance." He was issuing commands from a textbook, imposing a theoretical order onto a fluid, chaotic situation. The uniformed woman, Commander Evelyn Reed, had not moved. She stood near the side of the stage, a picture of absolute tranquility amidst the rising tide of anxiety. She had tilted her head slightly, listening not to Finch, but to the building itself. Her eyes tracked the subtle movements of the air vents, the flicker of a security camera, the placement of the exits. Finch noticed her stillness, and it infuriated him. "Officer," he snapped, his voice sharp with condescension. "Did you not hear me? I am taking command of this situation. Your assistance is not required." Reed's gaze shifted to him. For the first time, she spoke, her voice low and even, devoid of any emotion. "Negative, Dean. You're creating a bottleneck at the primary ingress/egress point. You're clustering your assets. You're making noise." Her words were technical, precise, and utterly dismissive of his authority. The insult was not in her tone, but in the cold, hard competence of her assessment. She had just dismantled his entire understanding of crisis management in 3 short sentences, and he was left sputtering, a king of theory dethroned by a single, hard fact. Before Finch could formulate a retort, the simulated drill escalated. Red lights flashed on the auditorium doors, indicating they were compromised. Through the sound system, the exercise controllers announced the presence of multiple hostile actors within the facility. The theoretical problem had just become a tactical one. Finch froze, his textbook solutions inadequate for the sudden, terrifying immediacy of the scenario. The crowd's nervous chatter turned into panicked murmurs. It was in that moment of institutional paralysis that Commander Reed moved. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She simply raised her left hand. Fingers splayed in a gesture that was invisible to the panicked academics, but was a flare of pure meaning to the 100 other quiet professionals she had brought with her. Throughout the summit, they had been ghosts, unseen, unheard, blending into the background as technicians, aides, and observers. Now, they materialized. From the shadows of the auditorium, from hidden alcoves, from among the crowd itself, men and women in civilian attire moved with a silent, synchronized purpose that was both beautiful and terrifying to behold. Reed issued a series of clipped, one-word commands, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. "Triton, seal exits Bravo and Charlie. Cerberus, eyes on the catwalks. Aegis, establish casualty collection point. Center stage." Her teams flowed like water, a network of interconnected cells communicating through subtle hand signals and encrypted earpieces. They were not a crowd. They were a single organism, and she was its central nervous system. Reed herself drew a small, innocuous-looking device from her belt and calmly disabled the main lighting grid, plunging the room into a semi-darkness lit only by emergency strobes. To the academics, it was terrifying chaos. To her team, it was the perfect operating environment. Within 90 seconds, the entire auditorium was secured, simulated hostiles were neutralized, and high-value assets, the bewildered deans and professors, were cordoned into a protected zone. The exercise controller's voice came back over the loudspeaker, laced with genuine awe. "Exercise terminated. Blue Force, time to breach and secure, 87 seconds. All threats neutralized. All assets secure." Record time. A profound, deafening silence fell over the room. It was the silence of shattered assumptions. It was the silence of minds struggling to reconcile the librarian from the morning with the apex predator who had just orchestrated a symphony of controlled violence. Finch stood motionless, his mouth slightly agape, the useless textbook theories turning to ash in his mind. He stared at the woman, this quiet, unassuming officer, and for the first time in his life, he understood that he knew absolutely nothing. General Thorne descended from the observation booth, his face a granite mask of contemplation. The other university trustees and high-ranking guests followed in his wake, their expressions a mixture of shock and profound respect. They had just witnessed a masterclass in leadership, a level of operational excellence that few people ever see outside of a classified briefing room. Thorne ignored the stammering event coordinators and the bewildered-looking security staff. He walked directly onto the stage, his polished shoes echoing in the cavernous silence of the auditorium. His path was straight, his purpose clear. He stopped directly in front of the quiet commander, who was now calmly directing her teams in the post-exercise cleanup, her voice still a low, even murmur. Finch, seeing the university president approach, scurried to his side, eager to reclaim some semblance of authority. "General, a remarkable, if somewhat unorthodox, display," he began, trying to frame the event in a way that preserved his own dignity. "Though I must say, the lack of communication from the officer in charge was—" Thorne cut him off, not with a word, but by raising a single hand, a gesture of finality that silenced Finch instantly. The general's eyes were locked on the commander. He had seen that look before, in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq. It was the look of quiet competence, the profound confidence of someone who had been tested by fire and had not been found wanting. He noticed the small, trident-shaped pin on her uniform, almost hidden against the fabric. A symbol that meant nothing to Finch, but to Thorne, it was a sigil of legend. It was the mark of a Navy SEAL. "Commander," Thorne said, his voice resonating with an authority that Finch could only dream of possessing. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I am President Thorne." The commander turned to face him fully, her posture shifting into a formal position of attention. "Commander Evelyn Reed, sir," she replied, her voice steady and clear. The name hung in the air, a ghost from the past that Finch had long since buried. Reed. Ms. Reed. The scholarship student. The one destined for the trash heap. A wave of cold realization washed over the dean, so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. His face went pale, a mask of dawning, horrified recognition. The connection clicked in Thorne's mind. He had reviewed the files of distinguished alumni who had gone into military service just a month prior, preparing for this very summit. The name Evelyn Reed had stood out, a file so heavily redacted it was mostly black ink, but the commendations that were visible were staggering. He turned to his aide. "Captain, bring me the delegation file for Naval Special Warfare Command." Now, the aide, sensing the gravity of the moment, moved with swift efficiency, returning seconds later with a tablet. Thorne took it, his eyes scanning the screen. The silence in the room was absolute. Every person present seemed to be holding their breath, sensing that a fundamental truth was about to be revealed. Then, Thorne began to read, his voice clear and deliberate, each word landing like a hammer blow against the anvil of Finch's arrogance. "Commander Evelyn Reed, United States Naval Academy, Class of '06. Graduated with honors." He paused, letting the first fact sink in. "Basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, Class 260. One of the first women to successfully complete the course." Another pause. The murmurs began, whispers of disbelief. "Assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group." Thorne looked up from the tablet, his eyes sweeping over the academics. "For those of you who are unaware," he said, his voice edged with steel, "that is the unit more commonly known as SEAL Team 6. It is the most elite counterterrorism unit in the United States military." A collective gasp went through the audience. Finch looked as though he had been physically struck. Thorne wasn't finished. Over 200 classified direct action missions in hostile territory. Field promotions for extreme valor. Recipient of the Silver Star for gallantry in action, 2 Bronze Stars with V for valor, the Purple Heart. He continued down the list, a litany of heroism and sacrifice that stood in stark, brutal contrast to the petty cruelties of a university seminar room 2 decades earlier. When he was done, he lowered the tablet and looked directly at Reed, his expression one of profound, unadulterated respect. He then did something no one had ever seen him do for a junior officer. General Wallace Thorne, a retired 4-star general and president of Northwood University, snapped to the most rigid and perfect position of attention of his life, and rendered a slow, formal salute to Commander Evelyn Reed. "Commander," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "your alma mater is honored by your service. Welcome home." The story of what happened in the auditorium didn't just spread, it detonated. It moved like wildfire through the university's networks, from text messages between students to hushed conversations in the faculty lounge to urgent emails between department heads. The narrative was irresistible, a perfect morality play for the modern age. The arrogant dean, the king of theory, publicly humbled by the quiet, unassuming librarian, who was, in fact, a Tier 1 Special Operations commander, and not just any commander, but the very student he had once dismissed as trash. The tale became an instant legend, embellished with each retelling. The 87-second takedown time became 60 seconds. The 100 silent professionals under her command became 200 phantoms who had secured the entire campus without anyone knowing. Commander Reed was no longer just an officer. She was an archetype, a symbol of quiet competence and earned respect. Dean Finch became the story's villain, a cautionary tale whispered to incoming freshmen about the dangers of assumption and the rot of intellectual pride. His authority, built on a lifetime of carefully curated words, had been shattered by a single, undeniable action. The 100 SEALs under Reed's command, who had been conducting a week-long series of liaison meetings and site surveys for future training partnerships, now moved through the campus with a new aura. They were no longer anonymous support staff. Every student, every professor, now saw them for what they were, the quiet, disciplined instruments of a will embodied by their commander. Their silent professionalism, their polite nods in the hallways, their intense focus during meetings, it all became a constant, rolling wave of humiliation for Finch. Each one of them was a walking, breathing refutation of his life's philosophy. They were the living proof that true strength didn't need to announce itself. It simply was. The university, an institution that traded in the currency of reputation, was forced to reckon with the chasm between its espoused values of meritocracy and the ingrained culture of elitism that Finch represented. The legend of Commander Reed was now a part of Northwood's history, a cleansing fire that had exposed a deep institutional flaw. A few days later, Alastair Finch found Commander Reed alone, observing a tactical medicine demonstration her team was giving to the university's emergency services department. He approached her hesitantly, the usual confident stride replaced by a shuffling uncertainty. For the first time in his adult life, he looked small. He had rehearsed a speech, a carefully worded apology that preserved a sliver of his dignity, but when he stood before her, the words caught in his throat. The sheer force of her calm, her absolute lack of triumph or malice, disarmed him completely. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even looking at him with anger. She was simply present. "Commander," he started, his voice a dry rasp. I was wrong. 20 years ago. And this week. What I said, there is no excuse for it. It was arrogant. It was cruel. I am sorry." The apology was clumsy, a jagged and broken thing, but it was genuine. It was the sound of a man's entire worldview collapsing. Reed continued watching her medics for a long moment before turning her head slightly to acknowledge him. Her gaze was not forgiving, nor was it condemning. It was analytical. "We all make assumptions, Dean," she said, her voice the same low, even tone she had used in the auditorium. "It's a tactical shortcut. The mistake isn't in making them. It's in refusing to update your intelligence when presented with new facts." She paused, then added, "The important thing is what we do after we're proven wrong. The mission continues." With that, she turned her attention back to her team. The conversation, for her, concluded. She hadn't offered him absolution or forgiveness. She had given him something far more valuable, a professional directive, an opportunity to learn and adapt. It was a lesson in leadership more profound than any he had ever taught. The encounter humbled Finch in a way no public shaming ever could. He saw that for her, this was never about personal revenge. He was a footnote in her story, a minor obstacle overcome long ago. Her focus was on the mission, on her people, on the quiet, relentless pursuit of excellence. The story of Finch's apology also leaked, adding another layer to the legend. But the focus was already shifting away from him and toward her and the powerful, inspirational message she embodied. Students began to look at their peers from different backgrounds not with suspicion, but with a new sense of curiosity, wondering what hidden strengths, what untapped potential lay behind a quiet exterior. Months turned into a year. The Northwood Summit incident had become a permanent part of the university's institutional folklore. The auditorium where it happened was now unofficially known among students as the Quiet Room. The story was told to every incoming class as a lesson not just in humility, but in the true nature of strength. It fundamentally altered the university's relationship with the military, fostering a new era of collaboration built on a foundation of mutual, hard-won respect. One crisp autumn afternoon, President Thorne stood on that same stage, announcing the inaugural recipient of the Reed Resolve Scholarship. The scholarship, funded by a massive, anonymous donation widely believed to have come from a deeply humbled Alastair Finch, was to be awarded each year to a student from an underprivileged background who demonstrated exceptional resilience, integrity, and a commitment to service over self-aggrandizement. The first recipient was a young woman from a small rural town, the first in her family to attend college, who had worked 2 jobs to support herself while volunteering at a local shelter. As she accepted the award, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude, she spoke of the story of Commander Reed, a story that had given her the courage to believe that her quiet determination was not a weakness, but a profound strength. Commander Reed herself was not present. She was thousands of miles away, in a place that does not appear on public maps, leading her team on another mission whose success the world would never know. But her presence was felt. Her legacy was not a statue or a plaque, but a living, breathing change in the culture of an institution. It was in the way professors now listened more carefully to the quietest students in their seminars. It was in the way the university's top recruiters now looked beyond pedigree and searched for character. It was in the quiet confidence of a young scholarship student who now knew that her origins did not define her destiny. True legacy is not carved in stone or shouted from rooftops. It is not found in the echo of a name, but in the ripple of an action. It is the quiet competence that outlasts the loud arrogance. It is the silent discipline that becomes the standard for others to follow. Commander Evelyn Reed never sought recognition. She never wanted a building named after her or a scholarship established in her honor. Her entire life was a testament to the idea that the work itself is the only reward that matters, that respect is a byproduct of excellence, not its goal. The world is built and protected not by the braggarts and the self-promoters, but by the quiet professionals, by the ones who show up early and stay late, by the ones who master their craft in silence, far from the validating applause of the crowd, by the ones who, when faced with scorn and dismissal, simply pack their bags and get back to the work, knowing that competence is the only argument that can never be refuted. Her story reminds us that strength is often quietest when it is most profound. It reminds us that the most powerful voice in any room is not the loudest, but the one that speaks with the authority of demonstrated action. It reminds us that our assumptions about others are merely reflections of our own limitations. The trash heap of history is not filled with those who start with nothing, but with those who believe they are entitled to everything. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.